book of Acts is full of stories about the earliest people of the way, as the first Christians were called. Through these stories, we trace that tectonic social shift that happened when the people of the way followed the teachings of Jesus. Walls of division were torn down by the inclusive, welcoming, and caring communities that were fostered when the message of the gospel was spread throughout the Roman Empire. But as with all deep social change, it was not smooth and easy sailing. In chapter 6 of Acts, we read that the young Christian church had been growing so fast that cultural conflicts developed between foreign-born members and native Judeans. Following the lead of the synagogue, the Christians pooled their food and money to be distributed to their needy members. But the Hellenists, that is, the Gentile-born believers within their community, complained that their widows were being shortchanged. They spoke up, and the apostles, who recognized the truth of what they said, sought a way to make this right. So the 12 gathered, and all the disciples together, and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the spirit of wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them, and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." They prayerfully chose 7 men and commissioned them to this task. One of those 7 was a man named Stephen. Stephen's ministry is named after him, for he had the gift of caring for others. Now, we don't know a lot about Stephen from his name and the names of all the men chosen. We know he was a Hellenist, that is, a Greek convert to Judaism who followed the Hebraic law. We also know him as the first Christian martyr. Luke wrote that he was full of the spirit and wisdom and boldly acted. Even though he was not an apostle, he was remembered by that first Christian community as a man they held in high esteem for his basic implementation of compassion and justice. Now, the apostles knew that they were overextended by all their tasks and could not continue to deliver food to their widows. By recognizing and allowing others to serve according to their gifts, the apostles extended the mantle of service and leadership, and in so doing strengthened the whole church. Our congregation's consistent intention is to allow and encourage people to serve with their gifts. They multiply our congregation's ministry in many ways, whether it is serving on our local or international outreach committees, teaching our children and our youth, offering up prayer, making prayer shawls, organizing and hosting the Christmas bazaar, being a friendly visitor in the Visitors in the Parish program, or serving as Stephen ministers. The ministries of our church are expanded in hundreds of ways when members of our congregation heed God's call to use their gifts to help others. Stephen ministry is one way we can choose to serve. Our Stephen ministers use a lot of humanity's basic wisdom as they care for others. Their gifts that bring them into this ministry are from God, but many of the insights they apply have been developed in the psychological and counseling disciplines. Practical human wisdom that is also very much experienced as the grace of God. Stephen ministers are people who encourage us when we are faced with a crisis in our life. They face it with us so that we do not have to face it alone. They encourage us as we experience a life challenge and find our way through it. Now, Barnabas was also an encourager. In fact, his name means son of encouragement. And while we might call Stephen the first Stephen minister, Barnabas could appropriately be considered the second. He had all the characteristics of a Stephen minister. He was full of faith, mercy, patience, encouragement, and compassion. We first hear of Barnabas in chapter 4 of Acts. We know he joined the Christian community when it began in Jerusalem. Luke tells us there was a Levite, a native of Cyprus, Joseph, to whom the apostles gave the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith. Barnabas sold a field, then brought the money and laid it at the feet of the apostles, for this community held all things in common. Now we next hear of Barnabas in Antioch, where a new congregation was begun during the time of persecution in Jerusalem, which followed Stephen's death. Barnabas was sent to Antioch by the church in Jerusalem to encourage this new congregation. Luke wrote, "For he was a good man, full of the Spirit." It was Barnabas who sought out Paul in Tarsus after his conversion and brought him to Antioch. And it was Barnabas, as well as Paul, who were commissioned by the church in Antioch to make that first missionary journey. Now, he was probably an ideal traveling companion, for he countered the discouragement the travelers must have experienced when they met with hostility and sometimes violence. Barnabas' biggest contribution to the Christian church was the sermon he preached or a letter he wrote. He was an encourager and acted as a Stephen minister wrote to Paul and to his young cousin Mark. Acts 15 recounts the planning of Paul's second missionary journey. It began with a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas over whether to take Mark on that journey. Paul was strongly against it, citing an earlier journey to Pamphylia in which Mark, for some unknown reason, had abandoned them. The details are sketchy, but apparently it was enough for Paul to lose trust in Mark as a faithful, dependable traveling companion. But Barnabas assertively stood up for Mark, which may not have been easy to stand up against Paul, I'm sure. He was pretty strong, pig-headed is what I'm going to say, but he had a certain way about him, and it must have been very hard to argue with him. But Barnabas looked past Mark's flaws and had confidence that Mark was a man he could trust with such an important mission. Paul and Barnabas resolved this conflict by going on two separate missionary journeys, Paul and Silas to Syria and Cilicia, and Barnabas and Mark to Cyprus. Barnabas' encouragement for and patience with Mark likely had a significant positive impact on Mark's future as a person of the way. We later learn that Barnabas' confidence in Mark was justified because Mark earned his way back into Paul's favor. Because Barnabas had faith that a young man could overcome an earlier mistake, the young church was blessed with two missionary journeys instead of one. Stephen ministry is a ministry of encouragement. When Ian McGee was asked what a Stephen minister does, he provided this response. Stephen ministers are there after you've washed and returned the last casserole dish, after the divorce papers have been served and the bottom falls out of your life, after the last child honks the horn, waves, and drives away, and the house suddenly seems incredibly empty, after you arrive home following the funeral service and the emotions you held at late come crashing in on you, after the relationship is ended, but the wounds are still bleeding and painful, after the doctors have said, there's nothing more we can do. After the door has slammed shut for the very last time. After the phone call you always hoped you'd never get. After you realize the hands on the gold watch you received at your retirement party move more slowly than you ever imagined. After the nursing home director shakes your hand and says, welcome to your new home. After the gavel goes down, the handcuffs go on, and your loved one is led away. After the baby has arrived, putting more demands on you than you ever dreamed possible. After you find the pink slip inserted with what is now your final paycheck. After your family and friends have heard your story one too many times, but you still need to talk it out. Stephen ministers are the after people. One of our members has written this about her experience with her Stephen minister. I've had regular visits from Sandra, my Stephen minister, for the past year. Reverend Janice arranged for the Stephen minister following the tragic suicide death of my 59-year-old son at the end of June 2013. At first, I was reluctant to continue with these visits, but Reverend Janice and Sandra and my family encouraged me to persist. Sandra shared some very helpful resource booklets that dealt specifically with grief related to suicide. Sandra allowed and encouraged me to express my feelings, and she listened. I now realize that the visits of my Stephen minister have helped me move through my grief, and I have greatly benefited from the Stephen ministry. I now look forward to visits with Sandra. Stephen ministers help us move through a painful crisis to a place of healing and wholeness. They are called to be trustworthy, reliable, committed to the best care they can give, and hold everything they are told in complete confidence. They are called to grow in their own faith and trust the goodness of God to work in and through difficult and painful life situations. They are called to be skilled in using the tools of deep listening, empathy, and non-judgmental compassion which are taught in training. Stephen ministers undergo 50 hours of initial training, but growing and learning don't stop with those 50 hours. Every month when the group meets, they continue to train to offer care in a variety of situations, from death to divorce to unemployment to major life transitions. They learn to look at losses that we all experience over a lifetime, from the loss of a family member to loss of employment to loss of home, and retell the story within the context of God's larger story of hope and affirmation and life. You may have considered becoming a Stephen minister. If you believe this is what God is calling you to do, please speak with either myself or Janet McDowell, and we would be happy to discuss this further with you. Or feel free to speak to any one of our Stephen ministers, who some of them are up here, some of them have been reading, you meet some of them downstairs at coffee hour. You may be that person called to help others face challenges so they don't have to face them alone. Amen.